Well, my tenure at MTC is much like, it's just a reflection of what was going on at that time. MTC was created in '71, and when it was created, it was given authority to do things, but it didn't have much in the way of money. And so it went through several cycles, where you might say like steps of getting authority and then using that authority and then getting some more authority and using that authority. So I came in, I would say, midway through the first step. The first step was administering transit funding programs. Before MTC, funding was rigid. Essentially, it was oriented toward developing the interstate highway system. But almost immediately after MTC was created in '71, the state passed the Transportation and Development Act in 1972, which to this day is still the best state program for transit. And because in the MTC region you have many transit operators, the state had to find someone to administer the program. MTC, having just been created not long before that, became the logical place to do that. So I came in, what you might say is midway in the first cycle, and that of MTC learning what transit's all about and learning how to administer a transit program. And during that period, MTC did certain studies about how much funding would be necessary. MTC sponsored legislation, Assembly Bill 1107, which made the half-cent sales tax permanent in the BART 3 counties. 2 years later, right after Prop 13, MTC had to sponsor AB 804 to change 1107 to accommodate what had happened with Prop 13. So during that period, my task essentially was to guide the staff efforts and support the commission in terms of establishing a reputation for fairly administering those programs amongst transit operators. I would say the next cycle of MTC, which represented my second cycle, beginning roughly in '80 or '78, I guess, was the I would say operations and advocacy cycle. Operations because which really tied into advocacy. Maybe I should back off for just a moment. While MTC had major planning responsibilities, the major planning had been done before there was an MTC. The interstate system was still driving where the discretionary highway money was going. And the BART system was essentially driving what little discretionary transit money there was prior to that. And so MTC had a regional planning goal without any real authorization or the flexibility that was necessary to do for transit or anything other than building freeways that the commission may determine necessary. So interestingly enough, if you step back for a moment and look at the MTC Act and look at what the legislature was asking of MTC and what the legislature was creating in the first instance, they created an independent agency in MTC, and they said the law said not to be an agency of the state. And the composition of the MTC itself was interesting because they were local government officials and representative of existing regional agencies with like missions, like ABEG and BCDC. And finally, they said that MTC should develop a plan, but it should be a finance plan, but it should be not limited to the financing, rigid financial formulas that were, or categories that were available at the time, but instead to reach out and become an advocate, in effect, for whatever might be necessary. And I think maybe one other thing that should be said is that that initial act said that MTC, in creating its first regional transportation plan, which it adopted in 1973, in developing that plan should look to the plans of others that are already existing, like ABAG or BCDC, or for that matter, the BATS, the Bay Area Transportation Study Commission, which preceded MTC. And interestingly enough, that BATS plan, based on the old rigid formulas and based on the expectation they weren't going to be changed, would have more than doubled the freeways in the Bay Area. It would have ringed the Bay with an inner link of freeways. It would have put a second deck on the Golden Gate Bridge. It would have built a southern crossing. It would have had a freeway right down Ashby Avenue, tearing out all the neighborhoods between Warren Freeway and I-80 and so forth. It would have done a lot of things that from a transportation point of view might have made sense, but from a community point of view scared the dickens out of a lot of people. And so that first RTP plan had to sort of gradually start moving away from what the original act plans it had referred to. Now, a minute, that little digression that I've gone into to talk about the MTC Act and about where we are and what I thought was my second cycle that I was part of advocacy. This level of advocacy had to do with finding ways to get flexible funding so that the planning that we would do that would be different than the old planning could actually be activated, could be implemented. So again, historically, when the state would pass a gas tax, the battle would be between how much the state would use on its freeway and expressway system and how much would be allocated to the cities and counties for their needs. So there was always that battle. We at MTC, once we were created, saw ourselves as a champion of the cities and counties in that debate. But we were limited in our understanding of just what the cities and counties requirements were. And so we, among other things, established what was called the pavement management system, just so we could get our own technical handle on, what's needed to maintain 100 cities, 9 counties, streets, and road systems. So that it was a operational program we were getting into for an advocacy reason. But guess what? One thing led to another, and we went from one operational program to another during that period. And so we got into things like hiring our own engineers to assist the cities and counties with their signal coordination and so forth. And we got into whatever was necessary in order to develop what is now the Clipper system, but what then was just in some sort of an inter-regional or inter-operator transit pass. So we got into that, and then we ultimately got into the Trav Info program, which was the having better information to provide to travelers, which you can now get via 511, which we developed over a period of time. All of those operational things we started getting into in this second cycle, initially in support of our advocacy. The good fortune of it all is that the interstate system era essentially came to an end in 1991. Because in 1991, the new federal legislation authorization was passed. And we had been working, as I say, as an advocate for several years prior to that to see to it that when we got a new authorization, it wasn't like the old one. And among other things, we got lucky because Senator Moynihan from New York was guiding that legislation in the Senate. And he had his own prejudices, you might say, and they sort of lined up with ours. And so the Senate ended up passing a bill that with remarkable flexibility. The House sort of passed a bill that was similar to the old style. And of course the compromise sort of split the baby in the middle. But getting half a program was, was quite a feat as far as we were concerned. So in any case, when the iced tea program passed in '91, and it was signed into law by then President Bush, 41 as opposed to 43, it really did signal a new opportunity for everyone around the country to do things differently. Not that everybody around the country was prepared to do things differently, but because we had been anticipating this, we thought we were prepared to do things differently. So that takes us into what I would call the third cycle. And that was the cycle essentially just delivering iced tea. Iced tea being the acronym given for that legislation. And that was a remarkable opportunity. And in order to to share our view and to try to make sure our partners here in the region realize this opportunity, we immediately created this big conference and brought in all the big wheels from Sacramento and from Washington to tell our partners, just how they felt this was a new opportunity. And we created what we call the Bay Area Partnership of the main people that we had to do business with in order to implement the law. Now, mind you, you can go back to cycle 1 or before, whether it's ABAG or whether it's MTC, we all had all the same partners anyway. You don't get anything done in a complicated region without realizing you're doing business as a partnership. But nonetheless, just to put an exclamation mark behind the sentence, we called this big conference and created what we called the Bay Area Partnership. And in advance of creating the partnership, we'd had a series of meetings and we'd brought in a retired federal official to sort of goad our friends to be interested. And we had this big meeting, kicked off the partnership, and from that started implementing the so-called iced tea program of flexible funding, where we were able to do, as we then characterized it, fund 500 projects for the price of 2 interchanges. And those 500 projects would be any number of transportation projects that were of direct interest to our city and county and transit partners and other partners that they could identify with. And so you didn't have 2 interchanges where in 2 parts of the region, you had projects all over the region that were meaningful and useful. And over the period of the next several years, we were able to demonstrate that we were in fact able to implement now the kind of plan that the MTC had created, as opposed to the old plan that we had inherited from the Bay Area Transportation Study Commission. My favorite, I guess, amongst the new programs that we now have the flexibility to fund are the one that's called the Transportation for Livable Communities program. And that one, there are a lot of little projects, but there's a couple fairly big projects that make it recognizable. The Fruitvale Transit Village in Oakland. Arabella Martinez and her associates did wondrous things in putting that together, and we didn't have that much transportation money in it, but we had enough in it to be part of the catalyst for making it happen. And the recently completed Ed Roberts Center at the Ashby Station where you bring all the handicap groups together in one place. The Americans with Disability organizations are there. We were able to provide, some transportation funding to get that off the ground. So those are fairly large, very significant, fairly large projects we had a little part in. There's lots of other projects where we have a big part in smaller projects. But in any case, the Transportation for Livable Communities program, which I think was, its first inspiration came from the transformation of Suisun City, which Jim Spearing there as mayor had a big part in. He was a member of our commission then, and he still is a member of the commission. Had a big part in that transformation, and he, as a member of our commission, was pushing for us to enlarge on that idea. So here's a case where the commission really stimulated us to do something that turned out to be quite important. Now, 2 years before I left, before I retired in 2000, that program was like $500,000 a year for planning projects and $10 million a year for capital improvement. So it was still a small program at that point. And the recently adopted MTC Transportation 2035 plan, they show $2.2 billion over the next 20 or so years for that plan. So if that doesn't demonstrate the difference between the old way of thinking and the old kinds of projects and the new way of thinking and new kinds of projects, I don't know what does. So that's cycle 3, implementing ICE-T. You couldn't get to cycle 3 if you hadn't done your advocacy in cycle 2 and so forth. And you couldn't have gotten to cycle 2 if you hadn't established your credibility in cycle 1 with the transit program. So, one thing built upon another, and each time that you delivered on a program, it made the case for some additional authority so that you could do better as you moved ahead. I would say that the MTC, at least, is in its 4th cycle now, and it was only just getting off the ground a couple of years before I retired. In a sense, it was anticipated. It was anticipated in that as we were always seeking funds to do things that needed to be done, bridge tolls, we had our eye on the bridge tolls, and so going all the way back to the 70, whatever it was, 76 or so, 77 when 842 passed, there was a 25-cent increase in bridge tolls, which provided some money to matching money for transit capital programs. And then in 88, Senate Bill 45, which authorized regional measure number 1, where we went to the people and got a vote for bridge tolls, increase in bridge tolls. So we were always in there agitating for bridge tolls, and we were getting little increments as we went along. And then finally in 97, MTC was asked to be sort of coordinate and supervise the process of getting the new bridge design. That ended in, that we went through that process through 97 and 98. And concurrent with that process was a large debate in the legislature about how to pay for the extra costs of all of the bridges, which all of which were running over what had been estimated much earlier. And the debate, in a sense, was how much of it do you take out of gas taxes, which is a statewide source, and how much of it you have to take out of tolls, which is a regional source. And Senators Kopp and Lockyer, who were representing our interest, were trying to make sure it was mostly gas taxes and less tolls, and other legislators obviously wanted the other option. But in any case, out of that also came a concern that there be more protection for defense of the tolls, whatever revenues we have. And so MTC was given some new authority in 98 with the creation of BATA, the Bay Area Transportation Authority. I would say we spent the first the remaining 2 years of my life at MTC, we spent one just trying to find out exactly how much money we had in the state's bank. In other words, how much of what was in the toll fund. We had to hire some expensive accountants just to figure that out for us. And then the other thing we had to do was we hired some outside consultants to help us figure out how the program was managed in order to try to move it along and make sure it wasn't going to cost any more than it had to. Well, in any case, one thing has led to another since I left, so that in 2005, the BATA, Bay Area Transportation Authority, has been given essentially the responsibility, has been made a real total authority, and has been given responsibility for all of the accounting and as the fast track program and so forth. And so I would say this 4th era, you might say, is the bridge building era. And if you'd like to sort of close a loop, I would suggest that if you go back to the beginning, the reason that there was ever an MTC at all was essentially the same reason that you might say you have an ABAG, and clearly the reason you have a BCDC is the Bay itself. I mean, the Bay is what makes this a region. It's not just physical, but it's political, and it's I think in our bones, in our DNA. So it's the thing that attracts us. The region, after all, is the 9 counties that touch on the Bay. But it also is our challenge, and therefore BCDC was created to make sure that we didn't destroy this lovely thing that brings us together. And that regional ethic, you might say, existed at the time that MTC was to come along. And I think that the, at the time that MTC was created, Governor Reagan had had a transportation task force who had come up with 5 recommendations of what to do. One was to create regional transportation districts. And the Bay Area Transportation Study Commission, which preceded MTC, had come up with the recommendation that we create regional transportation districts. And even though those recommendations came forth in hearings that Assemblyman John Ferran, who was the chairman of the Assembly Transportation Committee at the time, in hearings that he had in 1968, and testimony from these folks who had made these recommendations, they were sort of damning the recommendations with faint praise. Now, I had the good fortune of being in the right place at the right time, because I was working for the state legislative analyst then, and John Ferran had asked the analysts to support these hearings he was having in 1968. And, I can remember that, to me, the essential question then was, obviously you're going to have regional transportation administration. You had it then. You had it in Caltrans, District 4. It was a regional agency. And he had ABAG to work with as a partner. But the thing that happened with, so at that time, as I viewed it, the question was, if the Reagan task force was recommending districts, and there seemed to be consensus for regional transportation districts, then why wasn't it moving ahead? And why should it move ahead? And in the report that I wrote for Mr. Ferran's committee, I essentially said your choice is between continuing with a District 4 type operation or having what became an MTC type operation, was 2 things. One is that the District 4 was naturally focused only on the state system, the state part of the system. And what was required was a bigger view of the system. You need to be able to see the local, integrate the local arterials, and you needed to integrate transit. That was part of it, just in the name of efficiency, transportation efficiency in the narrow sense. But in the larger sense, the reason that the freeway and expressway programs were getting in trouble is because they've been banging themselves into neighborhoods with big, wide freeways that weren't always appreciated. And when your mission is only to deliver the interstate freeway program, you are not necessarily attuned to the interests of the communities, or sufficiently attuned to that in order to not see the values that you're bending when you build these systems. And so the second reason then that an MTC type operation, instead of continuing with District 4 type operation, would be to have an institution capable of filtering into the decisions these community values. And so that was, at the time, that was the genesis of my recommendation as to why you would go with an MTC organization. As I look back on it now, I think that was valid then, but I think the reason that it happened in the Bay Area, I mean, that argument would would be valid anywhere in the state. But only here did an MTC type organization get created. And there was essentially two big reasons. One is that whole business of the Bay bringing us together and being the necessity of the challenge. That it brings us together, but it also creates the challenge in solving our problems. It was that, and of course, it was also because you had our local legislator in charge of that legislation. And so here, it was done, and it was not done elsewhere. So if you go back to the beginning, it was the Bay, it was politically and physically the Bay itself that was of strong impetus for the regionalism here, and therefore for MTC being created. And now finally, I would say in the fourth cycle, MTC's fourth cycle, it is building bridges over the Bay that has become the most noticeable function.
And as a basis for comparison, how many employees and what was the budget of MTC at the time you started versus the time you left, if you can recall?
It was essentially the same. I mean, in terms of the number of employees, the budget would be higher because of inflation, and probably somewhat higher because we were, as I say, moving into operational programs. And when we did that, we were hiring kinds of talent that we didn't have outside.
So even at the beginning of your tenure then, you were able to mobilize the number of people that existed in 2000 when you left?
Well, I think it's interesting that the MTC Act didn't provide funding for MTC staff. So initially it was a starved organization. And all the Act did was say that MTC had the right to secure monies from ABEG and Caltrans and the cities and counties or whoever might have some money. It was a fishing license. Fortunately for MTC, state and federal programs came along quickly. So within 2 or 3 years, MTC actually started to have a fairly good budget, fairly good source of funds. They had some programs that phased out, like the BART impact study. They had I think 8 or 9 people on that project initially. When it phased out, other things picked it up. But in any case, MTC was 7 years old when I became the executive director, and at that point, it was adequately funded. It had something like 98 employees, I believe. And so 23 years later, I think we had like 109 employees or something like that. The mix was quite different, though, a lot different. I mean, when I was hired, we had part-time outside counsel. We got into a lot of things where we couldn't just afford to rely on part-time outside counsel. So by the time I left, we had 3 attorneys. We didn't have to have systems engineers when I came in. When I left, we had some system engineering talent on board and so forth. So the talent mix was quite different when I left than when I arrived, just because our functional mix had been changing over that time. And I think it's essential it's hard to describe and make tangible enough the importance of the commission. The critics, some of our critics along the way would say it was a staff-dominated organization and were unhappy because the commission wasn't given adequate direction, et cetera. In a really simplistic sense, it wasn't the commission saying, we want 1, 2, 3, you do 1, 2, 3. But in a larger sense, the fact that we had 14 commissioners appointed who were mostly elected city councilmen and supervisors, and then we had 1 rep from ABEG, 1 from BCDC. The fact that you had this, it was an independent agency. You had people representing local government. in order to get anything done, they had to work as a team. It was by definition, it had to be a teamwork. But obviously, this local representation made them sensitive to these so-called community values. You know, what is a community value? Well, it depends on what, when, and how, whatever thing you're achieving. A community value ends up in saying Ed Roberts Center at Ashby Station. A community value may say, you know, the Fruitvale Transit Village, or it may mean rehabbing a BART Missions District station, which is one of the things we did with TLC funds, just because the design of it was sort of creating problems instead of being an opening to a good system. So I don't have any definition for community values. It's sort of like art, you'll know it when you see it, or you'll like it or you won't know it. But what we had was a commission who were, you know, were always defining those community values, and they're by osmosis. And then, of course, that sort of direction to me as an executive director and amongst our staff was so that when we were recruiting and hiring, guess what? Well, I think, again, you got to go back to the beginning. I would say what would have happened if the state had decided in 1970, if the state had, or for that matter in Governor Reagan's task force recommendation had 5 recommendations, and had the state looked at those 5 recommendations and said, this is a turning point, you know, the interstate system's not going to last forever, how do we get ready for the next era? Had the state done that, had the state said, we're going to continue with our, it was then Department of Public Works, but now Caltrans district offices. They are regional. They're organized appropriately. And in a large sense, they were then and still are doing their job very well, in a large sense. What they didn't have was the direction to, say, partner with an ABEG in a much more meaningful way, and to partner with their local agencies, streets and counties in a much more regional ways, to see not just the California freeway and expressway system, but to see how it ties with the urban arterials and the transit districts and so forth. What would have happened if the state then had said, we're going to marry them up with the ABEGs of the world? Because that would be, that being our way to get that impetus that I'm speaking of that MTC had to get. Now, how did MTC get it? MTC got it, one, by its own composition, which I referred to, but the other is that the other voting members of MTC are ABEG's representative and BCD's representatives. Only 2 out of the 16, but 2 big votes, really, in the sense of what they represent. Well, obviously, the state didn't do that. And let me digress for a moment to show how, to me, it's surprising that the state never stepped up. Because even in looking at their own system, they didn't do things that seemed to me obviously they should have done. El Camino Real through from San Jose to San Francisco goes through 15 or so cities. But it's a state route. And it's just signal, 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 signal all the way. Now, wouldn't you have thought somebody would have thought about synchronizing those signals? But it wasn't until MTC came along and we hired engineers to make available to cities so that they would have the wherewithal to update and synchronize signals, and we also put capital money in there so they could do these things. So these, in other words, when I went back to the notion that the state's limitations were twofold, one was their picture of the system were too narrow. They weren't viewing the whole system. And then the second was that they didn't have this community values orientation that was essential. But I'm sure they had the authority. They could have viewed the system as a system even then. All they really needed to do was to try to figure out how to tie in better with an organization like ABAG to sort of make MTC unnecessary. So having said that, then how did MTC ABAG work? Well, we worked because we were put together in that original legislation. I might add, ABAG provided the bridge from the end of BATS to the beginning of MTC. There was a hiatus period, and ABAG collected whatever money was required, I don't recall, amongst themselves to join with Caltrans to keep the regional planning organization going until there was an MTC. So it was right there at MTC's birth. But the MTC representation was essentially a mirror image of the ABAG representation. What is ABAG's representation? City councilmen, supervisors. What's MTC's representation? City councilmen, supervisors, and ABAG. So with the ABAG to give it the regional impetus. So I think that's the most important thing. And so then it's a little bit like the earlier point about, well, what was the commission's influence on the staff? Well, it's just the way they think and how that thinking, it conveys itself to the staff, and how from there you build things. And so the ABAG community values concept was a part of the MTC concept, but it was also on the commission as a continuing reminder of what was required. So while we at a staff level worked together on things like demographics and various corridor studies and so forth, those were important, but I think they were, in a sense, minor. I don't want to understate it, minor compared to what the commission composition, ABAG composition, partnership, and that parallel views in those two compositions as directives were giving. Otherwise, I think the overall directive was even more important than the demographic work we were doing together and so forth. Well, from time to time there was friction, a little friction. I have a selective memory, and I remember what I like to remember, and I like to remember what we did as opposed to whatever friction we may have had. But I don't really think we ever had very significant friction. I mean, I can think of only one project where we worked together on a project staff-wise, but at the end, MTC voted one way and ABAG voted another, but it didn't matter too much anyway in the long run. It's on a project that died in any case. So no, I don't remember any significant friction. I can remember, some minor friction. Well, I think that the thing that we worked on together is probably the most complicated work that we did, in a sense. And it's hard to assess how successful it was. But it was essential that we work together. And that essentially was a joint air quality planning, which was ABAG and MTC in the Air District. And in '79, I think it was, we adopted that first plan. Frankly, when we did it, I don't think any of us fully understood what we were doing. Ultimately, there were certain milestones we had to meet along the way, and it turned out that we had either not made our promises clear enough, or that we had overpromised. I'm really overly generalizing this, but my memory doesn't go back well enough to be that specific. But in any case, we were sued because we hadn't delivered according to the plan. And then that got us into not only dealing with the suit, but also dealing with other remedies. And so that was an activity, that was the most intense and continuing activity of joint work between the three agencies. And it had to be done. Obviously, we hadn't done it quite well enough or we wouldn't have been in a lawsuit and so forth. But I think we were, at least amongst us, breaking new ground, and I guess it's not surprising maybe we made some mistake along the way and are overpromising or not adequately defining or whatever it was. Well, the goal was to reduce the amount of you know, the state air district would set goals in terms of air pollutants, and the goal of the study was to show the degree to which our collective interest in the region would stem the increase in these pollutants, and to have measures that we were supporting that would act to reduce the growth of these pollutants. And so the question was whether our measures were adequate, and at least the suit was to say that they weren't adequate and we had to add measures, and then the question was whether they would be adequate and so forth. And that air quality process continues. But as I say, for a joint exercise, it was clearly our most challenging. And I don't know how to assess it otherwise.
What other projects?
Well, there were a number of sub-regional studies that were done. For example, in Santa Clara, there was a sub-regional project there that was completed, I've forgotten, probably early 80s. One outcome of it was the choice of the Guadalupe Corridor light rail system. It was probably the most significant outcome of it. I was a big study. I don't remember the details of it, but you know, a lot of demographic work, which that's a place where MTC and ABEG always got together. And so that one, I guess, in contrast to the air quality work, that one had a nice positive outcome. But it was an easier piece of work, too.
Who were your counterparts at ABEG during your tenure at MTC?
Well, the executive director for most of my early years was Reuben Tranter, and then Jean Leong was the executive director after when Reuben retired a few years before I did.
So during your tenure, your 23 years at MTC, what accomplishments happened during your watch that you're really proud of?
I think that it was important for us to carry on the tradition I inherited it, in a sense. When I was hired in 1977 by MTC, I was very happy to join MTC because I knew something about it already. Here was a commission that seemed to get along and work together in a positive spirit. And so I think that if I were to say what's the single most important thing that I did was to pick up on that and contribute to the development over 23 years of a continuation of that positive attitude, a continuation of being an organization that wanted to be a team member with others and accomplish things as opposed to unnecessary haggling, and to build a staff with the competence to deserve the credibility we needed to to then build more authority and be able to achieve things that the Commission hoped to achieve, so that we would have credibility and we would ultimately secure something like the iced tea legislation in '91. Now, mind you that authorization legislation in Washington is so huge that there's no one agency or no one individual that can claim credit for anything. As I say, we got lucky that Senator Moynihan was predisposed to do the sort of things we were looking for. But nonetheless, we as an organization did work with every organization that was involved here in California and in Washington. We were tied in with the alphabet soup of organizations in Washington to try to get them to view things the way we were viewing it, to get behind the right kind of legislation. And for the most part, we were pretty successful at that. So to have an organization that started as a sort of a, who's this little planning agency, that by '91 it had a large hand in the delivery of iced tea, it's overreaching to take that much credit for it, but nonetheless it was something to be proud of, to have been a part of it. And especially then once it was adopted from '91 on, to demonstrate, as we did, what changes we could make to implement it and implement those programs now that are so at variance with in their content from what you saw before. Certainly that would rank amongst the accomplishments of choice. So there are lots of others, but well, I guess if you maybe to organize a discussion would be to go back through the cycles. You know, why was I hired in the first place? You know, I think part of it was because I'd spent 6 years at BART, and so as MTC was moving into a transit administration process, you might say, they were looking for someone that would, as I remember it being stated, would stand up those nasty general managers at transit systems. And so maybe they thought I could do that. Well, in any case, so that's one of the things that became necessary. I think maybe it would be, well, in any case, so that first cycle I was involved in is when we did pass legislation to make the transit funding permanent, but the legislature looked to us to create the Transit Operator Coordinating Council, and for us to chair it, and for us then to establish certain kinds of conditions that would hopefully keep the costs down, and the transit operators would raise their fares as they should. One interesting example didn't come until like '94, I think it was. So in any case, in '94, BART was looking for an assurance of, like, well, as it turned out to be, I think like $400 million for its capital program, not to build new things, but to replace things that were wearing out, like the trains and so forth. And they were looking for an assurance from MTC. At the time, we had some discretionary money that we were allocating to AC Transit that could have been going, some of it could have been going to BART, and we were allocating all of it to AC Transit. So we got into this discussion with them through a committee. You know, I can just cite for you instance after instance after instance. When we'd have a tough deal, we'd get the commissioners involved. You know, the importance of the commission, I just have to keep coming back to it. Who you have on the commission, their perspective, and their ability to relate to their peers, so that we're all working from the same music. So in any case, we cut this deal. That's not a good way to put it, I guess, but anyway, had this agreement that we would commit to the $400 million from the sources that were available to us to fund BART's repairs. But we intended to continue to fund AC Transit out of this other money that BART was not getting a part of. Not only were we going to continue it, there were two other factors. One was BART hadn't raised fares in a long time, so they weren't doing anything to help themselves. And that if we were going to commit, then they had to raise their fares to also contribute. If they thought they really needed money to do the maintenance and they had the ability to raise fares to do their maintenance, and they had to do it. So one part of the deal was taken care of there, and that wasn't. And the other was BART didn't raise the fares. So finally, I wrote a letter to then General Manager Frank Wilson that said, you know, we're doing our part of the commitment, but our part's going to be reduced every year by the amount that you haven't raised your fare unless you get those fares increased. And before I sent the letter, I called up Ed Campbell, then Alameda supervisor, member of MTC, and said, Ed, you know, maybe this is me going a little further than an executive director should go. So if you don't think I should send this letter threatening BART that they damn well better raise fares or we're going to cut back on what we allocate. And he says, well, that was the deal. He says, send the letter. So we did, and they raised the fares. So that's one example of how, you know, these things happen. You were looking for examples of things that went well. I think that we did develop an ability to work well with the transit operators in that cycle. The so-called well, we got in the ICE-T bill had a lot of things in it even beyond what we had hoped for. One was it had in it this encouragement for intelligent transportation systems, which what you see now is navigation systems in cars and things like that. I mean, the car industry got interested, and so they do that kind of stuff. You don't see as much of what the public would do, but in any case, in the early 90s, we had an organization called ITS America, which I at one point was chairman of, and I got involved in it just so that we could take advantage of whatever was coming out of DOT, and we were very active, one of our staff, very active. But in any case, we did get an early grant, I've forgotten how much it was, to develop what became TravInfo, which was our working with Caltrans to get better information what's going on out. Caltrans had these loops out there to count traffic, and they broke half the time, and you got bad information. And so a big part of TravInfo was one, how to make sure you got better information, and then two, how to process it. And then ultimately, that fed into another project we had about how you take all the transit operators' information and bring it together so you could have better information for the public. Anyway, so these are two technical exercises coming up that we finally put together. And initially we had a phone number for each area code, 817-1717, which was awkward. And then in the early Clinton years, Vice President Gore pushed the idea of a 511 number for transportation, and nobody was doing anything with it. You know, he came out with the idea, and his own DOT wasn't doing anything with it. But we saw that as a great opportunity because we were tired of having to deal with 4 different area codes or 5 different area codes. 511 sounded wonderful to us. So we got into a field with federal agency we'd never even been involved with to try to push that. And also I got after the head of APTA, the American Public Transit, AASHTO, American State Highways officials, ITS America, and I guess it was those 3, and I said, for crying out loud, you guys, this is a place where you got to all be together. This is a win-win-win. There's no losses in this one. To get behind it. And believe it or not, maybe 6 months later, I got a call from the guy who was head of the executive director, president of ITS, and he called me up. He says, "Larry, I just want you to know that Bill Millar and the head of AASHTO and I are right here together, and we're working on the 511 issue. You're right, we're all together on the darn thing." And as it turned out, we did get 511, and MTC was an early implementer because we were trying to get there, and so you see the 511 ads up all over the place, and you can dial 511. You don't have to go through a whole bunch of other stuff. So it was the long process of building that was one of the operational things that ultimately, it takes forever, but ultimately it produces big dividends. The Clipper card, the transit Clipper card, I hate to tell you how long we worked on that one. We started in '84 with a project, and somewhere along the line we hung this equipment on the 3 CTA buses so we could develop this card for all transit agencies. Well, the long and the short of it is mechanically we couldn't make it work. We just couldn't make it work. So it was a demo project that died somewhere within 3 or 4 years. But in the process we did learn one thing, and the thing that we learned was, as hard as the mechanical problem was, the real problem was the back office banking stuff that we had to do, so that if you ever did the mechanical fixed, you could rationalize all these complicated fare structures that every different operator had, and you could account for it, and they would get their money every month or every day or whatever it was. So, you know, moving into probably the early 90s, we went out and started over again, but this time we started with the banking approach and then moved into the technical approach. And then probably early 90s, we hired, the prime contractor was Motorola. There was a Australian subcontractor that did the software to develop what is now Clipper. We got an awful lot of foot dragging on the part of operators. I mean, it was a nightmare project of coordination and other elements. The major supplier of transit equipment, Cubic, didn't want competition coming in, so they were doing all they could to make it hard for us. They had been invited to bid on the project that Motorola bid on, and they didn't bid. But then I could never understand their logic, but I hate to say that, you know, now that I've been gone 10 years, sometime a few years ago, their logic panned out. Cubic ultimately took over the contract. So Cubic's sole source is a sole source deliverer of transit equipment, fare equipment, most of the country. So they now have Clipper. So the good news is, though, that once they got a hold of it, then they decided to make it work. And the other part of the good news is that AC Transit and Golden Gate were early implementers to get it started. And that then Muni came on big time. And without Muni, the program would never have been, would never have gotten off the ground. But Muni has. And so now it's really a fast building. But isn't this interesting? Because it's only now that it's being seen as a success. This is 26 years after we started that program. And 10 years after I left. I mean, this was one that I wanted to be accomplished long before I retired, and wasn't. But anyway, I'm very pleased to see it, and very pleased that even though we made some mistakes along the way, it's finally getting there. Well, you know, I think rather than trying to go project by project, I could take you from now until next week talking about all the projects that we worked on and some of the inside things about it, I suppose, that might be interesting. But I think if I was just looking for a way to close, I've extolled the values of the Commission over and over, and how their values, in a sense, was always felt by the organization, and I think contributed greatly to its whatever success it's had. what I haven't done as much is talk about the fact that that imbued that direction from the Commission. And here's one digression. In 23 years working for a political organization, not one time did some commissioner tell me who I had to hire for something. Not one time.
That's pretty amazing.
Now, if I could have said the same for BART when I was there, I might have still been at BART. No, I wouldn't have been, but I mean, or probably any other political organization. But not one time did that ever happen. So in any case, with the Commission, we didn't sit down when I was hired there and define this is policy and this is management, and you do policy.
Well,
so in any case, as I started to say that when I was hired, I didn't sit down with the Commission and define policy here and the management there, and here's the line and neither of us will cross. I mean, we essentially had an understanding from the beginning. So I had a lot of freedom in terms of how I developed the organization. Now, not only did I have freedom, but I had the good fortune of being in the Bay Area, where you have all of these universities and colleges and so forth. So you have great, and also a great environment. So you have great resources in terms of the talent pool, but also because of people wanting to live in this region. So in terms of recruitment, we were able to, you know, we had a good pool to choose from. In terms of once you able to hire good people, I reflected back on the 8 years experience I had with the analyst's office, where from the day you went to work there, you were put in front of a committee, a legislative committee, to defend whatever it was you'd worked on. And you know, at the beginning, you're scared to death, and after a while, you figure it out. And so I wanted the staff to do two things. One is have a credible relationship with the Commission, but I also wanted them to develop that skills of being able to articulate whatever it was. And so I'm reflecting back on my experience in the analyst's office. I did the same thing at MTC. As soon as I could, I put them in their feet to the fire and put them in front of the committees and let them defend the work, and made it clear to them that we weren't going to hide anything from the Commission. You know, we make a recommendation, but if there's some downsides, we tell them. And so that was all part of developing the credibility that was necessary. So in any case, whatever, I think partly because our mission was one that certain kind of people identify with, of whatever the reasons, I think it all came together in the sense that we were able to attract and develop a really first-rate staff. And that, of course, in turn, contributed to our building credibility as an organization. So I enjoyed very much working with the staff. I very much missed that on retiring. You know, retiring is not easy. As you and I commented walking in here, after 10 years, I've gotten used to it. It was clearly time, my time, it had come to leave. I think I left at just the right time. But that doesn't mean that I didn't miss, you know, that I was totally happy about it, because whenever I would have left, there have been regrets in some sense of not being in the middle of things. And you know, even now, once in a while, some issue will come up, and I'll wish that I could get into the foray. But I think most of all, I miss just working with the staff, and you know, I had learned to work the policy side and the commission side and the legislative side and so forth. But I never enjoyed that nearly as much as just working, trying to develop the rationale for what it is we're supposed to be doing. So I think I would close on that, because as I say, we were engaged in a good deal of controversy over time. If we wouldn't have been able to accomplish anything if we'd been afraid of controversy.
As you look back, are there any things that you wish you could have finished? I mean, like the Clipper card during the 23 years?
Well, I wish we could have done it more rapidly, yes, but I'm glad to see that at least it didn't go away. I think that if there's one regret I have is that, and it's not just with MTC, but it's with transportation as a profession. And this takes a little bit of background development. When there was an interstate system, everybody knew what the brass ring was. It was building that system. So there was a discipline there, and the Federal Highway Administration was tough. State Departments of Transportation were tough. Their partnership was ironclad. The Congress kept pouring the money in as it was necessary. Because there was continuous funding, if you made mistakes, you could hide them so you didn't get your reputation ruined and so forth. So, and it was this, there was congressional discipline. But it was coming to an end, and the interstate system in some states was being completed, all of a sudden they weren't seeing the money they used to see. And so they were looking, well, how come we're not getting any? And the real beginning of the big earmarking started to come then, because they couldn't get any money in the interstate system. It was complete in their state. So that started that. So when I got involved in the advocacy program for what became ICE-T, my view was that if you don't want the Congress meddling around earmarking, et cetera, and if you want to be able to make the case for big bucks like Interstate made the case for big bucks, you better have a system and a discipline so that you'll be able to say this is the reason for it. And that was one side of my argument. And the second side of it was, if you want to look at where the transportation problems are in America, they're in the big metropolitan areas. That's where the congestion is. That's where the demand is. That's where you need big bucks. And that's where it's hardest to do what's right and so forth. So from an intellectual point of view, I said, you need to define a metropolitan system. The national system needs to be the metropolitan systems and the interconnecting federal system. Now, I might add, that idea didn't start with me. It actually was the one that was put forth by some people way back in the late 40s, before the interstate was even authorized, but it was forgotten and lost. I thought about starting this interview with that, but you got me started in a different direction. Well, in any case, when Federico Pena was the secretary under Clinton, he did come out with a half-hearted attempt for a national transportation system. But the U.S. dropped the ball. The U.S. dropped the ball even with ICE-T, because they had to write regs for ICE-T. They wrote the regs, even though the ICE-T referred to the Metropolitan Transportation System and the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which is what MTC is to manage it. ICE-T said it. The Fed bureaucrat dummies didn't pick up on it. And so, you know, one answer I was told was, well, it wasn't written in capital letters or some damn thing. But in any case, my view is that the professionals gave the store to the politicians. When you go to almost any organization, the head of the organization sounds more like a politician than a professional. You just hear them advocating projects on whatever basis is the political song of the day. And there isn't a grounding in what is the system, how do you efficiently not just build it but manage and operate the system, the whole discipline. I mean, I used to give these, what are in a sense outlandish speeches. I would rub people's noses in it. You know, I had this one speech I started that had to do with a hurricane in Florida where the people are trying to get out of the town, and they got to the toll agency. Instead of opening the gates, they were collecting tolls, and there was this miles line, you know, waiting to pay the damn tolls. You know, I thought, now, if you're going to manage a system, for God's sake, when there's an emergency, you don't put barriers up in front of the people trying to escape. And so I would find those examples of how we weren't managing the system. But if you don't recognize a system, if you don't see a system, then you don't even think about managing it. You don't think about the operational things that you can do. Some of that's happening now, helter-skelter. You know, in the ITS community that Intelligent Transportation Systems I spoke to, that helped us get started with TravInfo, the public interest in that came from the toll authorities. That's about it. That's where the public interest came from. So there's some of that, you know, so now you're seeing congestion pricing and tolling is a big deal academically. That's all I can think about. But in any case, I don't see the transportation professional community offering an alternative to the political. And I think as long as that's the case, you're losing, because in the political sphere, transportation is so far down the list on people's priorities, it doesn't even matter. They complain about congestion, but nobody sees any reason to invest more in anything.
Well, you're talking about lack of leadership then, aren't you?
Yeah, well, I certainly am. But I think lack of well, in the political community, not necessarily. It's just that the political community's got wars and taxes and air quality, you know, global warming. There's a whole long list of things. You know, at the national level, the Department of Transportation has never been high on the agenda.
But look at the legacy you left behind, Larry. Every time a new administration comes in D.C., they cherry pick people out of MTC.
Well, I think it's, you know, well, that gets back to the staffing. I mean, hell, even Prince Charles hired one of our guys. You know about that?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, Hank Dippmeyer, I hired him twice, and then he went to SDPP, which he did a great job there. I tried to keep him from going there, but he did a great job, because that was the second, after I'd hired him the second time. No, he's been over there now 8 or 9 years, maybe more. Prince Charles has this like 55-member environmental think group or something. I don't even really know what it is. And lo and behold, he hired Hank to run it. Hank's been in London working directly for Prince Charles for several years. But also some of them are professors, you know, of course, some of them are oriented that way. Yeah, no, I'm proud of the staff we had and what they've been able to do.
Let me ask you a last question. When you came here in '77, did you have a vision of how you wanted to shape the agency, or and sort of see this goal at the end of the line that involved a more holistic approach to transportation and what the agency could do, or did you just sort of have to adjust to what the input that the commissioners gave you over time?
No, I had a view of it. I mean, mind you, I didn't come in blind at what MTC was. I mean, again, I go back when I worked for the analysts in '88. That work that I did for Foran is probably the best work I ever did in a sense. And I mean, he was predisposed to do what he was going to do, but I gave him the ammunition to support what he wanted to do in that report when I worked for the analyst office. So I had a real good idea then. And then, mind you, when I came to the Bay Area in '69, I worked for BART for 6 years, and at the beginning, my major part of that was planning. I ended up being the acting general manager, but I started out in the planning side, and I immediately attached myself to MTC, to Paul Watt. Paul, the first executive director, and I were good friends personally and professionally. And so I volunteered to be the head of their technical advisory committee. And even though I had a lot of axes to grind at bar, nonetheless, in that capacity, I was doing for Paul what he wanted done. Okay, so I had an inside view from the very beginning of MTC. So when I joined MTC, yeah, I had a good idea of what why I wanted to join this organization, what I wanted it to be. All that said, I've never joined any organization without being surprised by what I didn't know, too. When I left BART, I joined A.D. Little as a consultant, and I thought I knew what I was getting into, and I found out I do. No, I didn't. But in any case, when I came to MTC, there were some surprises, and in a sense, I got a little bit lucky because you asked early about staffing, and when I first came in, the managers there pushed me to push the staffing up, but right then Prop 13 passed, and in the light of Prop 13, I said, no, we're not going to add staff in the light of 13. Well, then I discovered really that the staff had come in to do certain things, but other things needed to be done, and having a little more time to think about it, I realized that I didn't have the staff mix I needed, and so I needed to find some way to call and build. And so fortunately, I didn't add to, so I would have to do more calling than building, And I also wanted to do whatever calling I could ever had to do in a very quiet way, for lots of good reasons. Again, going back to the idea, I want my staff to feel good about coming to work, but nonetheless, you do have to do some culling. And so you do some things sometimes that may not always make them feel good about coming to work, depending on how the grapevine works and who says what to who at the coffee table or something.